Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And this week we're talking about a bill here in Wisconsin that will require all public school classrooms in the entire state to display the phrase, "In God We Trust." This is just a small part of a nationwide campaign in the Christian nationalist movement. We're going to talk about it today, and joining me is my friend Ryan Jayne, Senior Policy Counsel at FFRF. Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Liz. Thanks for having me.
And as always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. So if you have any questions about this bill or the use of the national motto in general, please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer questions during the show. So let's talk first, a little intro on this bill that's been filed in Wisconsin. Tell us some background on the bill. What does it do? Who proposed it?
Okay, so this is in Wisconsin. It's Assembly Bill 56 and Senate Bill 53. What it would do is it would require the national motto to be displayed in every classroom in the state, as Liz mentioned. And it should be noted, this is an unfunded mandate. So this, in other states, we've sometimes seen this where they will say you have to put up the display if they're donated. But in this case, the schools are required to do it, but there's no language to that effect. So schools have to figure out how to pay for it as well. But with the funding issue aside, the obvious objection from anyone who is not religious is that this is putting up a religious motto saying that you trust in a monotheistic God in every public school classroom. Public schools are, of course, one of the paramount places where you are supposed to be able to trust that you have a secular government. So major state church implications right off the bat.
Right. And this bill seeks to kind of add in or plug in God We Trust, the national motto, alongside other things that we expect to find in every public school, like the American flag, right? Like it's that part of the state statutes where we would see all the requirements for what a school has to display in a nationalistic vein, and just kind of plugging in the motto, and the fact that it's in God We Trust just happens to express, be an expression of religious belief, but really it's a nationalistic, it's an American history and tradition type of rationale from the proponents of these bills.
Right, and I think it's important to remind folks about what the history of the motto is, because that is kind of their playbook. Is they want kids to grow up thinking this is part of our national identity in God We Trust, because they can say, correctly, technically, this is the national motto. But what they're likely not going to tell kids is that it became the national motto relatively recently in the 1950s. So this is a McCarthy era adoption where the Congress was so afraid of being labeled as godless communists that they did things like they plugged "One Nation Under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance, and they put "In God We Trust" on our paper money, and they adopted it as the national motto.
Right. And importantly, this is not a founding era, first American principle, right? Our founders actually did debate and adopt a national motto. It is not "In God We Trust." It was E pluribus unum, which is Latin. It means out of many one. And the American ideal being expressed was that we're a nation, we're a pluralistic nation, right? We're a many and diverse different people that have come together as one American nation. And that only was changed from the time of the founding to the 50s. That was our national motto. It was only changed in the height of the Cold War.
And I think that's what's so frustrating about this to me is the irony of it, that right. With the national motto, our original motto, E pluribus unum, is about unifying diverse populace. It's about pluralism. And "In God We Trust" is specifically divisive, especially when you look at the modern makeup of the United States. monotheistic believers, and Christians used to be a major majority, and it's not. It's a slim majority now. There was actually just an updated study that came out today as well, and we can see some statistics on the screen that this is a generational shift that we've been seeing for quite a while now, where older generations are more religious. Younger generations, though, are much less religious. And also, over time, we can see that people in all of those brackets become less religious. Now, it is important to point out with this graphic that when we talk about nones, N-O-N-E-S, that doesn't necessarily mean atheists. So that is just an important qualifier to make sure we're not misrepresenting anything. But there is a crystal clear shift away from Christianity and from monotheistic God belief. And this chart, I think, is really important to wrap your head around, because some people say, well, the reason that younger generations are less religious is because you get more religious as you get older and wiser. But this is not true. Look at all of the generational shifts over time, even amongst older folks. As you get older, Americans have become less religious, not more religious.
So in every generational bracket there,
every single one.
Over time, each generation within the generation is becoming less religiously affiliated, meaning they don't, even if they would define themselves as spiritual or have some sort of higher power belief, they're less affiliated with a specific religion, which is exactly what the national motto was adopted to do, which is identify the nation with a specific monotheistic Christian God. And so it is the most frustrating part of all this, which is like, it really doesn't get to, what so many sort of conservative lawmakers claim is their guiding constitutional philosophy, which is what would have been the intention of the founders, or what would have been considered, the American principle at the time of the founding. It just happens to conform to this Christian nationalist kind of makeover of the American founding that so many conservative lawmakers are pushing.
Yes, and the irony of it is it's doubly frustrating to me because it lines up with the irony of the insertion of one nation under God into the pledge, because it originally said one nation indivisible, and so it's literally, ironically, being divided by the phrase under God. So it's undercutting exactly what is being said, and just like that, In God We Trust is a motto that directly undercuts the original motto, which, by the way, was adopted by a conference of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. And so, as Liz said, if you care about what the founders were interested in, they wanted a welcoming, pluralistic society, with a little asterisk by there, obviously. They didn't have everything figured out perfectly, but on this particular issue, they got it right.
There was not a religious element. There was not a Christian nationalist element to the founding.
Correct.
That is a rewriting of founding era history. And that's what this whole campaign for In God We Trust to be, emblazoned on our public buildings and now in our public school classrooms is all part of. So speaking of that, we can't talk about this bill without doing a little kind of throwback history to a little something called Project Blitz.
Yes.
So Project Blitz, if you haven't heard of it in the last few years, is kind of like the OG Project 2025. It was Christian nationalism before Christian nationalism was cool. This is back in, so the 2020-2021 version was the latest one we know of, but we heard about this way back in 2017-2018 is when this first came on the scene. And Project Blitz was basically a legislative playbook for a Christian nationalist sort of takeover of government and legislative policy. A lot like Project 2025 now, but a more nascent and like legislative focused version. They had a whole literal playbook that was model bills and basically like 3 phases of legislation that could be proposed to move the country towards a Christian legal framework.
That's right. And their strategy was kind of twofold. So on the one hand, they knew their end goal. They wanted to undo certain changes that had happened. So they were unhappy with Supreme Court cases like a Bergefell that allowed same-sex marriage and reproductive autonomy, these sorts of things. They really wanted to undo that, but they knew it wasn't politically popular. They didn't have public support. So what they did is they asked themselves, how do we get public support? And what they figured out they need to do is they said, well, we need to re-educate young people first. So that's why the Project Blitz playbook begins by targeting public schools. And it goes in, and this In God We Trust National Motto Bill is literally the first bill in the entire playbook. So they want to put things like the national motto and the 10 Commandments and Bible classes into public schools with the intent of retraining American students' brains with this fantasy that we are a Christian nation, so that when they get older, the hope is then kids would be more susceptible to the argument that actually, because the Bible is against same-sex marriage, the United States legal system should be too.
Right.
So that's half of the strategy. And then the other half is the reason it's called Project Blitz. Because they knew this was going to be unpopular, they decided, let's just hit up every state legislature all at once with all of these bills. So the idea was to do kind of a blitzkrieg of state legislation, and that was their approach the entire time.
And they did do that, and we saw kind of like a blitz of these, religious heritage re-education type bills. Back in 2018 and 2019, there was a little bit of pushback or backlash to the project because it was so kind of concerted and like seemingly nefarious, with this obvious end goal of bills that really would do harm and undo a lot of the progress made by the gay rights movement. And it kind of went underground. So around 2019, the whole thing kind of went underground. It became harder to find online. It wasn't publicly talked about as a concerted effort. And so that 2020-2021 version of the playbook was the kind of the last one discovered. And of course, it's evolved. A lot of the same backers, organizations that have coalesced to form Project 2025 were some of these same players in the Project Blitz original playbook.
That's absolutely right. And a big part of the success of kind of scaring Project Blitz into obscurity goes to a lot of our viewers, people who are advocates of state-church separation and of our secular history, are the ones who made Project Blitz toxic. So we helped to organize people to show up and to label these bills and call them out for what they were. So because some legislators didn't know that bills like this were part of this wider Christian nationalist campaign. So we would point it to them, we'd come with our receipts, we'd bring links to, this is the playbook and here's this bill you're voting on. And it became toxic because of that. So that's why they changed their name from Project Blitz to something that's actually so bland and forgettable that I literally don't remember what it is right now. But our work on this topic is still available online. So you can go to blitzwatch.org to check out the actual playbook and all the work that we've done on it, along with our partner organizations. Right.
So this, like you mentioned, this specific model bill that is now belatedly being taken up by, it's almost quaint that Wisconsin is finally kind of getting around to, hey, we should force In God We Trust into all our public school classrooms. We have a conservative majority, but that was the first bill in this playbook because it was seen as the most unobjectionable, mostly, I think, because In God We Trust is, unfortunately, our national motto. And so there's this argument that, like, how could it be unconstitutional or unlawful to require our public schools to display our national motto, even though it is a statement of religious belief. And, our public schools are our most in my opinion, like the greatest wielding government institution wielding power over the public, because like where else is there more government power than in our public schools, which have all of our children as a captive audience, compelled by law to be there. And of course, they're the most vulnerable and the most impressionable of all American citizens, which is why Project Blitz targets them.
Absolutely. And what we've seen in these states who adopted this bill in the past, because as Liz said, Wisconsin is kind of late to the party on this. So a lot of these bills that were on the initial wave of Project Blitz legislation, what we're having to combat with now are things like Ten Commandments bills. So states that have In God We Trust already in every classroom, now what they want to do is they want to put a copy of the Ten Commandments. And the argument goes, of course, in part that, hey, it already says In God We Trust right there. So why don't we put God's laws right next to it? It seems like it makes sense. So you can see this is kind of the camel's nose under the tent approach to trying to open it up to more and more Christian nationalist policies. And we've also seen in a lot of states things like today in Michigan, I saw a resolution condemning Obergefell and trying to bring back a prohibition against same-sex marriage because the Bible defines marriage as between a man and a woman. So they are trying to claw back in this very deliberate way. And it is the same groups, as you said, that are behind this. So groups like Wall Builders are one of the groups that was on Project Blitz, and they're the same people showing up to say that we should put up the Ten Commandments because it's history, and this isn't about religion. This is just about our national heritage, which is total nonsense, but this is their plan the entire time.
And that rationale is what's being extended to argue for these Ten Commandments bills in public schools, right? It's all part of, well, this is a American heritage type of legislative purpose. Like, we're just trying to bring into our schools for our students to see that America has this strong religious and Christian, obviously, heritage. And the Ten Commandments is sort of, this set of principles that undergirds all our civic laws. And it's so significant to our cultural and legal heritage that it belongs in public schools, just like the national motto. And so we're seeing it's just kind of an extension of what was the Project Blitz playbook, but it's just been exploded to this scale because there has been an even further rightward lurch even amongst the Christian nationalist movement in terms of what is possible and what they want in terms of remaking public life, starting with our public schools.
Yes, and speaking of how they want to rework our public schools, I wanted to point out that this bill was finally introduced during National Public School Week, which is this week, and it seems like there's a trend of the kind of legislative monsters wanting to do this, where they see a bill that's about something, if it's about a racist policy, it's like, let's release this on Martin Luther King Day just to kind of stick it to the other side. So I don't know if this is deliberate, but our public schools, needless to say, are, especially in Wisconsin, but all over the country, are desperately in need of more support, more funding. And I wrote an op-ed that you can see on the screen for a local newspaper in Wisconsin about how the supporters of this bill are all also supporters of Wisconsin's voucher program expansion. And what that means...
What a coincidence.
Yes. How about imagine that? So when our public schools are desperately in need of more funding, what they support is diverting that funding from public schools to unaccountable, privately led, almost entirely religious schools. And so it's particularly, I opened the piece by saying it's almost like a cruel joke that schools are asking the legislature in Madison, please give us some funding. And instead, what these legislators who are actively taking funding away from schools have done is they said, how about instead you put up a display that says you're going to pray for help because we're not going to give you any help. And by the way, you're going to have to come up with a way to pay for that display.
Right. It is beyond just cruel and ironic to drop this bill on or during National Public School Week when we're supposed to be raising awareness for how vital our public schools are to our communities and how underfunded and under-resourced they are. And of course, conservative policies, including school vouchers, is a huge part of the problem. And we know that in God We Trust mandates and all of these other religious mandates in public schools are just not only unconstitutional and religiously coercive, but they're a giant waste of time that nobody's asking for when public schools really do need things from our state legislatures. So it's infuriating, in addition to being kind of a cruel joke during National Public School Week. And you can check out Ryan's op-ed in the Wisconsin State Journal. It was published last week.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that it is a really important point to just emphasize that this is not a debate about, do we believe in pushing God or pushing religion, or is it atheists who are taking control? It's like not some sort of social battle over religious belief in public schools. It's so much more fundamental and important than that. This is about the importance of strong, inclusive, secular public schools. And so it's part of a wider fight that's been going on, and it is something that is so crucial for the future of our country because, as you were saying earlier, Liz, this is the most important pressure point that our government has on us. It's a captive audience of vulnerable kids who are compelled by law to be there. So we should be fighting like hell to make sure that it is the way that it ought to be, that it's providing a well-rounded, fair, inclusive education for everyone. And so this sort of bill, I think it needs to be very widely condemned by everybody who cares about public education, about state-church separation. You can't let this kind of stuff go. Don't let yourself feel like, I've got bigger fish to fry. I think this is a big one.
We know now, what the harm spiral actually was, because this is kind of the rare thing where it's plucking this step one out of the Project Blitz playbook, where we're now at step 100 along the way. We know that this leads to greater and greater incursions on our students' religious rights, and worse, it undermines public education writ large because it does ignore crucial needs that public schools have, while also inserting this kind of harmful ideology alongside with the patriotic and nationalistic components of, daily observance in public schools, which is a whole nother question. But we do have our kids standing up and saying the Pledge of Allegiance and saluting the flag. And it's now throwing God We Trust up there. And the whole point, it's not just a coincidence that what that message that sends to kids is that to be a patriotic American also means you have some sort of God belief. You trust in God and you're all religiously, homogenous. And that is not the message that we should be sending to our kids in public schools. It's wrong. We have many non-Christian, not just non-religious, but non-Christian, minority religious students in American public schools. And they deserve a secular public education where they don't feel their kids are being brainwashed to believe in a God other than the one that they are teaching their kids about, if any at all.
Absolutely. And this also ties into a national discussion, of course, that's a whole separate discussion we'll have to get into, but attempts to do things like, amongst others, dismantle the Department of Education and broader federal attempts to support private school vouchers and to undermine public education. So this is part of a broader and just incredibly important topic.
Right on. Okay, I'm going to see if we have any questions and see where that leads the conversation, Ryan. So here we go. All right. What happens if a school district doesn't comply with the bill?
So that's a good question.
Depends on the law. This one's a mandate.
Yes, this one is a mandate. So an affected person, so any parent or student presumably could go and get a court order to require school districts to do this. So unfortunately, I think school districts' hands are pretty much tied. This bill is written in very clear language that school districts have to make sure that this happens, and it's, like any other bill of that sort. If you don't do it, the court's going to come in and make you do it.
Or could.
Yep.
Are bills like this, we kind of answered this, but let's kind of take this on. Are bills like this likely to be introduced in other states? Probably a critical mass of states already have a law like this on the books.
Yep. Yeah, it was a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago or so, in the heyday of Project Blitz, when we saw just like dozens of these bills introduced and many of them passed. So I think we are past a majority of states that have this at this point. So and you can go, there's actually a pretty good Wikipedia page that has a map of which states have this. In some states it's optional, in some states it's mandatory, but it definitely has shown up all over the country, and in those states that don't have it, I'm sure we will continue to see it.
The fact that we're seeing it introduced in 2025 here in Wisconsin is, I honestly was kind of shocked by this, like, still. You kind of thought we got to a point where all the states that didn't have this law on the books probably weren't going to, fall prey to Project Blitz. But here we are still dealing with newly introduced In God We Trust mandates in public schools. And like Ryan said, Christian nationalist organizations that operate behind these playbooks have just upped the ante more and more and more. So at the same time as we're seeing these In God We Trust bills still trickling into legislatures, we're seeing way worse religious coercion being legislated, such as the Ten Commandments version of this bill, which mandates every public school in the entire state to display the biblical Ten Commandments. Obviously that's been passed in Louisiana. We've seen those bills being proposed in other states, and that has previously been ruled on by the Supreme Court as flatly unconstitutional, but that has not stopped Christian nationalists from proposing those bills, and even in some cases passing them.
Yeah, and just like we've seen that, like copycats of that Louisiana bill pop up all over the place, I guarantee these sponsors would be pushing a Ten Commandments bill in Wisconsin if they thought that was palatable. But they're seeing this as the first step. We start with this one because it seems a little bit less obviously unconstitutional, and then they're going to move on to that next.
I don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to throw it out there just for a conversation. How much would this cost schools? When we talk about an unfunded mandate, it's kind of hard to say because a lot of different things could happen. Groups could donate posters to individual school districts. That's happened in other states. But we're talking, a bill like this, we're talking every single public school classroom, not school, classroom, required to display something, and it could be in the form of a poster or an inscription or something else. And so it's not insubstantial when you're talking about every single classroom in every school district in an entire state. So, yeah. I mean,
I think the language says it has to be, durable and of a certain size.
Right.
So if a school district is really trying to save costs on this, maybe, they can print paper and laminate it, make their own posters. And if so, I mean, that's staff time as well to do that and set it all up. And even then, it's still going to be in most districts just thousands of these that you're going to need to make to have one in every single classroom in every single school. So yeah, it's not insubstantial at all. And in the bigger districts, it could just be a massive amount of money.
Mm-hmm. And also, like a complete way for this is not an investment. It's not, something that has to do with outcomes. It is a purely, Christian nationalist push to like indoctrinate, brainwash, put this in front of students to make it so that a certain ideology is reflected in the classroom. There's absolutely no yield for students, whatever the cost is. Yeah. And again, it's not the state legislature that's coming up with the money or funding this mandate.
Yeah, and it's an ongoing obligation. So if a poster gets damaged, you have to replace it. If you build a new school, how many classrooms does it have? This is one more thing you have to have in every single classroom. Right. So I mean, this is just an ongoing, pointless thing.
Cool. Okay, if a bill like this comes up in my state, what can I do about it?
I love that question.
Yep.
And the most important thing you can do, of course, is to contact your representatives. If you haven't talked to your state rep and your state senator this session, you absolutely should. I always say this, but state representatives do not get nearly the attention that they should. There's so much attention on federal issues that if you're a U.S. senator, you get just hundreds and hundreds of emails and phone calls every single day. But if you are a state representative, you have constituents who you actually can help their lives in a lot of different ways. And the reality is they just don't hear from that many constituents. It's a few squeaky wheels who reach out to them. So if you are not currently one of those squeaky wheels, please become one. And even if it's not about this issue or not solely about this issue, just reach out, introduce yourself, say, hey, I'm a constituent, these are the things I care about. And also, even if they are either squarely opposed to you or you know that they're excellent, still it is worth voicing your opinion, reaching out to them. The other thing you can do is you can become an advocate with the FFRF Action Fund, our lobbying arm. We send out action alerts on bills like this at key times when you can reach out to often state legislative committees when they are considering a bill like this. We will provide sample talking points so you can send that to them and say, I oppose this bill and here's all the reasons why. And if those folks who are decision makers get a flood of well-reasoned, polite feedback of please don't do this, it oftentimes just takes one or two who might need to take a second thought to actually kill one of these bills, because you have to go over a lot of hurdles to get one of these bills passed. So that kind of advocacy is really, really key. And then the other thing, of course, is helping us to educate the public, which is what we're doing right now, but sharing anything you have about these sorts of bills within whatever your circle is. So on social media, word of mouth, writing op-eds or letters to the editor, anything that you can do to get the word out to people to generally change public opinion is ultimately where we're going to have to win these battles.
Well said. And then that gets to another question here, which was, I think you answered it, but how do we get ahead of these things rather than having to keep stopping them? Unfortunately, these types of bills are going to keep being proposed and worse. We have to be prepared to really agitate at the point when they're being considered, especially in committee, before, so many bills die between being introduced by some showboaty Christian nationalist or some group of them and getting through the committees that they need to be reviewed by before they get to the floor for a vote. And so many bills die during that time, and it's not very, especially in the state legislature, it's often not very public, and not many people know that these things are being considered. Many of them are messaging bills to, fire up these constituencies that want this type of thing. But if they do get pushback during those stages, it will cause some of these legislatures to rethink that aren't rabid supporters of Christian nationalism, but they think something like this is harmless or maybe even politically a net positive. If they hear agitation in the other direction, it'll matter. And so that's the point at which we really need to kind of step in and act so that we're not fighting all these laws that once they're on the books.
Absolutely. And we just saw this, for instance, in North Dakota, where the legislature is not super favorable in terms of state-church separation. And we saw a truly awful bill that would have required intelligent design to be taught alongside evolution. And this also, easily unconstitutional, but that doesn't mean it's not going to pass. But, folks came out in force to oppose this bill, and legislators who you wouldn't have thought would have come out against the bill decided to take a pass on it, because when they get that kind of pushback, they have to pick their battles, and they decide, this isn't the one I'm gonna go for this session. So it's absolutely worth it to put all the pressure you can on them. And
again, that was killed early-ish in the process. Correct. And so, the earlier it is in the process, the more power you have, or I think the more influence you can have on what legislators will do. Yeah, and of course, if you hear about bills, most of these are on our radar. We have a whole, like Ryan said, a C4 arm that is doing is more focused on lobbying and legislation tracking. So most of these are on our radar. But if you see a bill is filed or you hear about legislation in your state and you want to report it to us, you can always do that on our website, ffrf.org/report. You can always, learn more about bills that we're tracking at our website. There's one question here I'm going to throw out there. Do you know, only because it leads me to another part of Project Blitz. So maybe we can't speak to this, but we'll speak to that. Do you know if there will be any appeal after the religious daycare ruling in Colorado? I don't want to speak specifically about that case, but that did remind me that the end game of Project Blitz, which is now just a tiny part of Project 2025, was not only undoing anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, but also had a big focus on exemptions for religious actors. So in other words, making it so that foster care and daycare agencies could deny people based on their religion, and also healthcare exemptions, same thing across the board. So that anywhere that anybody had a religious objection to serving anybody, to giving equal treatment to non-religious or minority religious parents that want to foster or that want their kids in daycare, things like that. That would be across the board valid religious objections, which means a decrease of the protections under the law for people in these minority groups, especially LGBTQ people. That was kind of the end game of Project Blitz, the phase 3. Yep. And that has, of course, that project has been quite a big success, especially with the courts, the rapid rightward shift of our federal courts has greatly expanded the rights of religious individuals to basically claim exemptions to laws that protect LGBTQ people in the marketplace, in healthcare, in daycares and foster care. And so that is an intentional part of where laws like this that seem harmless can lead eventually. That is the end goal. And so seeing those as tied to one big project is really important and something that we have had a hard time convincing people of, I think, but it has borne out in the Project Blitz, playbook from 10 years ago to now, and is definitely the end game of policies like this.
Yes, and it's also, this is part of this ongoing messaging battle, which is part of why it's so important for a critical mass of people to weigh in on this, where when you have, say, a healthcare provider who wants to deny care for someone, you could ask, well, is this religiously motivated discrimination, or is this a religious liberty protection? You could look at it either way, but the side that we would say ought to win is that your religious liberty does not extend to harming other people or infringing on other people's rights. It's a pretty basic principle, and it gets lost because that is exactly what they're fighting against. So the idea that this is a concerted Christian nationalist effort to allow for religiously motivated discrimination. That is a message that everybody can be reiterating over and over and over again, and just basically don't let them lie to you to say, well, this is just religious liberty. This is a fundamental American value, because that's not what we're talking about. This is not about religious liberty.
Right. And our founders understood this quite well, and it's not complicated. It's the distinction between belief and action that harms no one and action that harms third parties. And I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like your right to swing your fist ends at my nose kind of a thing, is what the founders understood and wrote about and was encompassed in their idea of free exercise rights. It wasn't a trump card for everything under the civil law for religionists. It was one part of a broader kind of mosaic of rights and protections primarily for minorities against the tyranny of a majoritarian rule.
Yeah, and by the way, the Supreme Court, up until relatively recently, understood this principle very well also. So
Right.
we often talk about a kind of little known amongst, outside the circle of state church lawyers, a case called Reynolds in the 19th century that, that led to this conclusion that your religious free exercise rights don't let you just disobey laws that you don't agree with for religious reasons. That's not how religious liberty works. You still have to follow basic laws. If your religious beliefs don't comport with them, that's kind of your problem, And so things have changed where they're just very recently saying, well, maybe we should just carve out religious exceptions, just because we are sympathetic for these particular religious beliefs. Needless to say, it's very selective applications.
Right, and it's harmful because instead of it being your problem, now it's everyone else's problem.
Yes.
You get to violate, or you get exemptions from these laws that are meant to protect everybody, and it's everybody else that has to figure out how to contain that damage and risk.
Exactly.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that. We'll be, updating everyone as this bill, hopefully dies somewhere along the process in the legislature, but if and when it passes, we'll certainly be updating everyone on that. And that'll wrap up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show Free Thought Matters airs this weekend. FFRF co-president Annie Laurie Gaylor turns the tables on her co-host Dan Barker. She interviews him about his new book, Contradiction, which he calls the death of the fine-tuning argument for God.
Well, a contradiction is an inversion of reality.
Okay.
Probably the most ancient examples of it is the sunrise. We have the word sunrise, right? We know today that the sun doesn't rise. The sun is actually stationary, stationary relative to the earth, and it's the earth that is turning. So it's kind of like, have you ever been on a train that's not moving and the train next to you starts to move and you briefly think it's you that's moving?
That's such a jolt.
Yeah, you get, your brain basically did a 180-degree reversal of reality, assuming that everything's from our point of view. Just like the sun rises. The sun isn't rising, we are rising.
You can watch that episode on TV stations around the country this weekend and soon on the FFRF YouTube channel.
And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, Dan and Annie Laurie will speak with Dr. Patrick Remington, Professor of Medicine and Public Health at UW-Madison. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers, including myself, discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org. And finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check us out at our website, ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. And if not, please join us. We will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.